Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the GM. And in this one, we're going to be talking about robotics. For those who don't remember it, and a lot of people don't, Robotics was a really cool toy line that was put out in 1985 by Milton Bradley. And then to promote it, Marvel Comics put out some stuff with robotics in it. And then there was also a cartoon. And the cartoon, by the way, was done by a lot of the same people that brought us classics like G.I. Joe and Transformers and stuff like that. So the whole thing has that kind of vibe. Something I thought was really interesting was a lot of the times in the 80s when you would get this sort of thing where toys were being promoted through multiple forms of media, like the comics and the episodes were being written simultaneously. So if the toy company gave them a jumping off point, right, the two separate teams were then going in kind of like completely different directions. You know what I mean? And so then the cartoon and the comics often didn't really line up very well, right? But with robotics, it was like almost the same thing. There are differences, but they are so minor. You would have to like really be paying attention to even notice there were differences. At any rate, I'm getting kind of ahead of myself. Before we get into the adventure itself, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. We have got an awesome community here, and that's because of you. Thank you so much for being here. So, with all that said, let's dive into it. The prologue to this one begins 3 million years ago on the planet Scalor, where there are two sentient races at war with each other. The heroes are a bipedal humanoid race with round faces, chalk white skin, and hands shaped kind of like the hands that Nightcrawler has in the X-Men or the Ninja Turtles, where it's like the three-fingered hands. And the good guys are known as the Protectons, and they are very peaceful, while their enemies are a race of ruthless, green-skinned reptilians whose posture is more like that of a velociraptor. They have tails as well as longer faces, fangs, and yellow eyes with slit pupils. They wear black and silver armor and they have like black dragon like horns. And they have a never ending thirst for war and conquest. And they're called the Terracores. But their war is cut short when their star undergoes a radical change. Solar storms ravaged the planet Scalor, destroying cities and burning fields of crops. With food dwindling, the Terracores began to loot the food stores, and the leader of the heroic Protectons calls an emergency meeting. The noble leader of the Protectons, by the way, is Argus. He says that in order to survive, Protectons and Terracores are going to have to work together. But the leader of the ruthless Terracores is called Nemesis. He says the Terracores have finished construction of a starship that they call the TerraStar, and he thinks they should use it like an ark and get only the most highest elites of their society to a new planet to live on. But he needs a gadget called CompuCore to make his ship work. Argus says that that's madness, though, that his plan only saves hundreds, but it allows millions to perish. Nemesis says, so what? They're genetically inferior, anyways. Just in case kids watching the show were unclear about who is bad or why they're bad. At any rate, so Argus asks CompuCore if there's an alternative. CompuCore, by the way, resembles a tall cylinder ending in something that resembles a TV set with a red screen showing a female protecton face. She tells everyone assembled that stasis tubes would allow for the survival of both races. So they put it to a vote, and there are more votes for the stasis tube plan. Nemesis is angry and he yells that they are fools who don't see that they are dooming themselves. Nonetheless, all the survivors of this alien apocalypse seal themselves in the tubes and enter a deep sleep. But as they slumber, the vault door is compromised and radiation floods into the chamber. So CompuCore is forced to take drastic action. CompuCore has many powers, one of which is personality transfer. So she literally interfaces with and downloads everyone's essence into her data banks as the radiation levels rise. Then CompuCore goes into hibernation mode and waits for the radiation to die down, and millions of years go by. Finally, one day in the mid 1980s, Harbinger travels to the distant planet of Scalor, and her arrival triggers CompuCore to wake up. Since the radiation levels are lower now, CompuCore transfers the life force of Argus into a large construction robot, which his people refer to as a Robotix. The idea is that the robotics mechs will rebuild the ruined planet. Nemesis, likewise, is also placed in a robotics body as well. All of the protectons, by the way, are made of light gray colored metal, while all of the terracores are made of dark metal that's either gray or navy blue, something like that. And given the appearances of these two races, the robots have faces that vary, but tend to be a blend of both of the face types of the beings who made them. So they're vaguely reptilian, like the terracores, but wide-faced, and they tend to be more bipedal, like the protectons. So after all this time, they begin to fight again. But Harbinger tells Argus and the protectons that they are needed on Earth due to the crisis on Infinite Earths. Argus says he can't leave CompuCore and the stasis pods behind, or the terracores will destroy the bodies of the remaining protectons. Likewise, he can't leave CompuCore behind either. So they are all taken to Earth. And once the crisis is over, the protectons and the terracores renew their hostilities, this time on our planet, which, of course, is a lot like the setup for Transformers. And that brings us to the main plot. Argus appears before the United Nations because he wants to revive his race, right? He wants to either somehow repair the bodies in the stasis tubes who have been affected by radiation, cure them and put them back in the original bodies. That's plan A. If they can't figure out a way to do that, plan B is to build more mechs, basically, and at least put them in these mech bodies so that they can do things and, be awake. But all of the countries of the world agree that the Earth can't sustain the population of an entire other planet, right? So for now, CompuCore must continue to contain each person's essence. Some of the protectons ask Argus if at least they can try to be transferred into organic bodies. Argus says that if they returned to small frail bodies right now, who would protect CompuCore from the terracores, who are taking full advantage, by the way, of their powerful new forms. Speaking of which, the terracores attack. They want CompuCore. So we roll initiative, and the villains went first, and Nemesis who again is the leader of the evil Terracors, attacks Argus, who's the leader of the good guys. Tyrannix, the schemer and second in command, he's sort of their Starscream. He attacks Jarok, who is the second in command of the heroes. Stegor, who is like a huge mechanical snake, basically, attacks Bront, who is the tough guy of the heroes. He kind of reminds me of Ironhide in a way from Transformers. And the dim-witted villain called Goon attacks Nara, who is a female Protecton who sort of puts me in mind of RC from Transformers. Hopefully you guys are familiar with Transformers. Otherwise, I'm explaining a lot of stuff that won't make sense. So we got into combat at this point, and this is where things get tricky. So like I think I mentioned earlier briefly, Robotix was a series of toys made by Milton Bradley, right? And some listeners will remember Robotix, or if not that, they will maybe remember Erector sets. And I'm guessing most listeners probably know what Legos are, right? Well, so as is the case with those toys or building sets, whatever you want to call it, Robotix was made for building. Specifically, it was made for building robots and vehicles. So before we ran the game, we watched the cartoon and we noticed several things. First, all of those pieces that all of the characters are made out of seems to be the exact same kind of metal. Each individual component should have a body in the 13 to 15 AP range in DC Heroes. And we base that on how we saw them interact with things like a rock slide. So hopefully that makes sense so far. As always, if you guys are confused about anything, just put a comment in the comment section and I will try to explain it better. I've said this before too, but and I apologize. This is going to be all over the place. This is going to be a weird video today. But when I'm used to communicating with my players in my living room, and so it's an immediate real-time back and forth process, right? So I always struggle when I do stuff for my YouTube channel where it's a completely one-way street, you know what I mean? So at any rate, um so we start with that base level of saying each piece starting out has a body in that 13 to 15 range. But what quickly became clear to us is that each piece also has an ability called power reserve, which means the more parts you plug into each other, the stronger your robot is. And interestingly enough, the toys themselves, which we used when we played, by the way, the toys came with motors that would allow them to move via these remote control devices, and you would connect everything using yellow wires. But the light gray parts that make up 90% of the robot had these tiny sculpted details on them, which led me to believe that in the fiction, right, in the game world, each of these pieces of metal contains circuits. And so actually its body varies then depending on how much energy that piece has in it. So in other words, when they're low on energy, their body is going to be lower than when it's fully charged. And what I mean by that is I don't mean they have more energy to work with, right? I mean the more you charge this material, like it is harder. You get what I'm saying? It's like a force field kind of a thing. It's harder to break the metal the more pieces are plugged into each other. Does that make sense? So that also means the bigger the robot, the higher their stats. And the Terracores, the villains, have the ability to do things like rip off a hero's arm and attach it to themselves and then have their body go up in APs while the victim's body drops. So cannibalizing one's foes then, when we played it, was the path to victory. Hopefully this makes sense so far. As yet another aside, I met Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons and Dragons, in the summer of 2001 at a retailer's convention at the Alliance Games warehouse in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I've kind of mentioned a little bit about that story before. That night, there was this new game that was being showed off at that convention, and it was awesome. And like everybody was playing this game, right? We were all playing together. And it was about robots, because you might be wondering, what is he talking about? Why are you going off on this weird tangent? So it was about robots, and the miniatures that you used to play were physical action figures, right? That were like 6 inches tall or something in that ballpark, I think. And they had holes in them where you could plug in all sorts of weapons and accessories. And I ended up playing that game all night long with the guys who were writing the third edition Dungeons and Dragons books at the time, and the guys who were writing all of the White Wolf role-playing books in the 90s. Who, by the way, those guys were like everybody at the table from White Wolf, they were all goth hillbillies. And I had never because I grew up in the country, and I've known a lot of hillbillies, right? Um, None of them were goths. So that was really interesting to me, but I digress. So in that game that we were playing, right, each accessory came with a card, and like the size of a normal playing card. And each card was basically a mini character sheet showing what that one piece of gear did, right? So when your robot would kill an enemy robot and loot its body, taking its gear, that would affect your character's stats, raising strength or speed or whatever. And everybody there was convinced that this was going to be the next big thing and it was going to revolutionize the gaming industry. So I ordered a ton of it from my store, and sadly, none of it sold. I took a huge loss. And the fact that I'm having to explain it to you and everybody doesn't already know what it is I'm talking about shows you that obviously it did not revolutionize anything, right? But man, I loved that game. It was an awesome game, and it is a travesty that it did not catch on. But I ripped it off when I ran my robotics stuff, right? But it what all of that means is it means that combat becomes insanely complicated, right? And a single fight took forever. So, like when we played the robotics game, it was a fight. It was a 4-on-4 fight. And it took us an entire Saturday. A lot of our fights, I've broadcast some of them and stuff like that, and you can see how long they take. And for a lot of characters, if two characters are like evenly matched, like let's say the good guy gets in 2 hits against the bad guy's probably knocked out after about 2 hits, 3 hits maybe, depending on the roll of the dice. That's just the average. In DC, combat tends to be pretty fast. They want to keep the game moving. But with us, we got together on a Saturday morning and we'd watch like the robotics cartoon first, and then we'd eat kids cereal, and we were all wearing t-shirts with Thundercats and Transformers and stuff like that on it, because nobody owned a robotics t-shirt. That was how we were gaming for like quite a while. but we didn't wrap up the game. I mean, some people were leaving and it was dark out and the game was still going. You know what I mean? So at any rate, I don't want to get into the round by round combat of a fight that took all day long, right? Um, because I think that most people would probably have fun playing in the game, but I think it would be really boring if I did it that way and I just uploaded a video to YouTube that was like hours long, you know, and honestly it's a lot of math, right? So that's not going to be a whole lot of fun to listen to. Um and then the other reason why I'm not doing it that way is sadly my basement flooded a few years ago, and the east wall of my basement is nothing but bookshelves full of three-ring binders, which is where all this stuff is written down, right? And the Robotix binder was on the bottom shelf during that flood, so all the papers got wet with river water. So sadly, I don't actually have the records of how the combat went, but just going based on memory, it started in New York, close to the United Nations building. The characters can fly, so the good guys fly north and they end up crossing over into Canada. There's aerial combat. The bad guys are chasing because they want CompuCore, right? Which the good guys have with them in one of their, because they have these compartments where like a pilot would go. So CompuCore is in there. Um, so everybody has this knockdown, drag out fight. Like I said, it took us an entire game to play it all, or an entire game. I'm sorry. I mean, that's true too, but I meant to say an entire day to play the whole thing out. And at the end of the day, the last man standing was Argus, the leader of the good guys. And by this point, you know, he'd have like one of his arms would be destroyed. And so he would beat up one of the smaller bad guys and use his arm and just so on and so forth. And like I said, we were doing our best. We did have the toys and we were playing around with the actual toys. And we had um cue cards with uh the stats for each piece on them. And for character sheets, we were using those small white dry I guess they just call it a whiteboard, right? Dry erase board, whatever. Like the kind of thing in a dorm, like all the kids have them on their doors, you know? That's what we were using for character sheets. Because not every single round, but maybe every other round, your stats would change yet again. You know, either you would take something from someone else and, you know, or vice versa. And one of the things we kind of came up with was the damage was all really based on the bodies and not the heads. The heads, we we weren't actually doing any damage to them. But in the end, Argus wins, and the heads of all of the villain characters were just left in a forest in Canada. He just kind of left. And we've never gone back and touched base to say whatever happened to those, and that drives my son crazy. He wants he wants to tell stories where it's stuff like, you know, the Canadian government comes in with flatbed trucks and cranes and stuff and loads these weird alien heads onto the trucks and takes them to a facility and, you know, whatever became of the Terror Corps basically. So we've never said they're not dead. Um, the heads have solar sustenance, so as long as there's sunlight, they're gonna live. And the funny thing is that's kind of worse than death if you think about it, right? That you're gonna kind of live forever, but you're just a head that can't do anything but lay around and be upset. At any rate, it's not great. So, all right, so let's get into the epilogue. So the Protectons, after the fight was over, everybody kind of sorts out the parts, right? So they get their parts back, and at the end of the day, they reconfigure themselves to be spacecraft. And since there isn't enough room for them on Earth, which we established earlier, the whole UN thing, they fly to Mars. And now that the crisis had come and gone, nobody is living on Mars anymore. So the Protectons get to work doing what they were literally made to do, which is build things. Mars is home to the biggest volcano in the solar system, Olympus Mons. So the heroic Robotix characters get to work building a geothermal energy collector array, so they can get power from the volcano itself. And then they build a metallic city here called New Xanadon, which Xanadon was the name of their capital city back on their home planet. And they even managed to build what is basically a Stargate in an attempt to create a portal that would allow them to travel between Mars and their old planet of Scalor. But something goes wrong, and the portal attracts a race called the Zytics, which are man-sized insects from another dimension. And they're attracted to this portal like a moth to a flame. And ultimately, New Xanadon is abandoned. About 10 years later, Earth's superheroes would come to Mars and find a Zytics hive here at the volcano that needed to be exterminated. And so that was a whole campaign of basically, we had been playing traditional superhero stuff for a long time and people were burnt out on it. They wanted a change of pace. So we went there and we were running this insect war thing, almost like Starship Troopers in a way, but with supers instead of soldiers. But of course, that's a story for another day. Um, and for now, that's it for our thing about robotics. This was a weird one, but I liked it, and I hope that you liked it too. If so, like, subscribe, and comment. And from all of us, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you next time.